My name is Rob Barnes. I'm the Climate Program Director at CAPE, the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. Really want to welcome you. Me and the team, I'd say, would like to welcome you because this is really a group effort to our panel discussion tonight. We want to find out what's next for the emissions cap. Where is it going? This is a landmark climate policy that the environmental community has been pushing for a long time, and it's got so many implications from health to Indigenous rights to the very kind of fabric of our economy. And so we want to dig in for a really multifaceted discussion tonight. I'm based in Ottawa on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. It's actually the quick translation of Ottawa is to trade, and it's a place of exchange where three rivers meet. And I hope that tonight we can make that happen as a group with our amazing panelists, as well as with your questions and the discussion that we're going to engage in throughout. So, keeping things in the spirit of efficiency and brevity, I'll give the speakers an introduction before each one speaks. So we'll introduce each speaker in turn, basically to save time. And I'd encourage you to use the chat function there that you can see at the bottom of your Zoom panel to introduce yourselves. Tell us where you're coming in from. It's a real pleasure to have folks from coast to coast to coast joining us at CAPE. And if you have questions for the panelists as the panels go by, please enter them in the Q&A function. If you do enter it in the chat, we'll try to catch it, stick it in the Q&A function so that we can have a really robust discussion. So tonight's webinar really takes place in three different components. So first, we're going to hear from four amazing panelists looking at the emissions cap from a variety of different angles. And then I will ask our speakers some moderated questions. And then finally, we'll open it up for a question and answer session. The whole webinar should take about an hour and 20 minutes. And we're hoping that the Q&A session will be for the folks who really want to ask questions towards the 8 o'clock Eastern time. So in about 55 minutes or 50 minutes, we'll open it up to audience Q&A. I just want to let the speakers know that if we go a little bit over, don't worry too much on speaking time. We can be flexible. We'll pull a rabbit out of the hat one way or the other, and we're going to have focus on having a really great discussion throughout. So with that said, and I know we are still waiting for one more panelist to join us. She's running a little bit late with a medical issue. Anyway, it's all going to resolve itself, and Sunshine will be with us shortly. But why don't I get to introducing our very first panelist tonight. This is Hyder Ali, who is with Environmental Defence Canada. He's the program manager for the oil and gas campaign at Environmental Defence. And Ali is a real leader. The Canadian environmental sector owes him many words of thanks because of all of his hard work leading a coalition of groups, including CAPE, on our advocacy efforts around the emissions cap. He's got a background in environmental science and sciences, that's the academic side, and then in terms of work in organizing and advocating for environmental protection. And he spent 3 years at Nature Canada, where he helped shape efforts to certify bird-friendly cities across Canada. So the nature file, the climate file, Ali does it all. And thank you very much for joining us, Ali. We really hope to hear from you next. So I'll be quiet and pass the torch over to you. Thanks.
Sure, absolutely. And thanks for that wonderful introduction. I'm just going to quickly share my presentation slides, if that is all right. Can we see this?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. All right. Good evening, folks. As Rob mentioned, my name is Ali Heatherly. I'm the Oil and Gas Program Manager at Environmental Defence. And quickly, if you are unfamiliar with Environmental Defence, we are a leading Canadian environmental advocacy organization that works to advance environmental and climate action at the federal, provincial, and municipal levels in Canada. Over the last 2+ years, I have been campaigning for the implementation of the oil and gas emissions cap. And over the next few slides, I'll spend some time talking about what this policy really is, its origins, why it's such a key and essential policy for Canadians at this time, where we're at in the current context, and how we can all work together and use our people power to get this essential policy over the finish line. So the proposed oil and gas emissions cap, as Rob mentioned earlier in the introduction, it is a groundbreaking regulation. It aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the production of oil and gas in Canada by setting limits to how much pollution oil and gas companies can release. Now, I know, as many of you may know this already, the oil and gas sector by far is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in this country. And for decades, scientists, advocates, community leaders, and many other Canadians have pushed federal governments to regulate their pollution. And we recognize that the oil and gas industry in itself has not and will not voluntarily reduce their own pollution. Finally, in 2021, as a result of that advocacy, Prime Minister Trudeau promised to limit and reduce oil and gas pollution at a scale needed to achieve Canada's climate goals. And for good reason, too. Since 1990, this sector has nearly doubled the amount of greenhouse gas emissions it releases, increasing by 89%. Here's a quick breakdown for the greenhouse gas emissions from different parts of the economy in Canada in 2022. This is the most recent year that the federal government has released the data for. And as you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, the largest source of pollution in this country does come from oil and gas industry, accounting for 31% of our total domestic emissions. But what is shocking to know, though, is that according to the oil and gas industry's own lobby group, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, this industry only contributes about 3% to Canada's GDP. 31% of emissions for 3% of GDP, that is a huge mismatch. Now, undoubtedly, fossil fuels are driving climate change. And knowing that in Canada, oil and gas companies have been unwilling and unable to reduce their own pollution voluntarily, we need the federal government to step in and enforce rules, strong rules, that will reduce pollution from the sector. But the significance of the emission cap goes beyond just meeting climate targets. Climate change is here, and Canadians are paying the cost day to day from coast to coast to coast. With the increase in frequency and intensity of unnatural weather events and the ever rising cost of meeting basic needs like groceries, insurance, and healthcare, Canadian livelihoods are being jeopardized because of climate change. And all of this is happening while oil and gas companies, who are actually the ones fueling climate change with their pollution, are making massive profits. A robust emissions cap would not only help reduce oil and gas pollution in line with our targets, but it would also safeguard the future livelihoods of Canadians. Now, the next few slides, I'll just speak to some of the increases in costs for home insurance and groceries. But in recent years, starting with home insurance, we have seen an increase for the cost that Canadians pay because of unnatural weather events. And we're seeing this not only in Canada, but also across the world as home insurance cost rises. According to the Insurance Bureau of Canada, last year, 2024, was the most expensive year for insurance payouts. And what is worse is that as climate change intensifies, this cost is only going to continue increasing. And this is a quick little breakdown. I wanted to compare and show the comparison of how cost of the home insurance has increased over the last 10 years per province. As you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, all provinces have seen an increase in how much Canadians are paying. However, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Ontario have experienced the largest jump in average cost. Similarly, another area where Canadians are now feeling the pinch due to climate change is at grocery stores. Over the last 5 years, the average household monthly spending on groceries has increased by nearly $300, which means that Canadian households are now spending, on average, $3,000 more per year on groceries than they were 5 years ago. And once again, as climate change intensifies, food prices will continue to rise as well. So what does that mean? That means that Canada, to protect Canadians, the economic well-being, the environmental well-being for Canadians, has to do its part to fight climate change. And in Canada, that means we have to address the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, the oil and gas sector. This oil and gas emissions cap is by far the best way to do that by setting strict limits on how much each oil and gas company can pollute. And there has been progress made on this end. In November 2024, the federal government did release the draft rules for the emissions cap, and that was a pretty major and positive step. However, the current design of this policy has to be strengthened to make it more effective. As it stands, the emissions reduction target in the draft regulation is way too low. The timeline for implementation is also way too slow. And the policy in itself includes loopholes that would allow oil and gas companies to wiggle out of their responsibilities. And there are, of course, some other challenges as well, with I'm sure many of you are aware of. The prorogued government and a potential federal election around the corner does provide a challenge for the federal government to meet its promise of finalizing the emissions cap rules within this federal mandate. And at the same time, you have the oil and gas industry and their allies undergoing massive greenwashing and misinformation campaigns to continue delaying and weakening not just the oil and gas emissions cap itself, but all climate policies across the board. But this is where the people power comes in. Now, obviously, we can't match the industry's media budgets. We can't go dollar for dollar on their misinformation campaigns. But the one thing that we have that the industry cannot replicate is the power of the people. And the progress that has been made thus far with this regulation has been because of that. But even with the draft regulations already being released, public pressure is so essential to continue ensuring that they are finalized and the oil and gas emissions cap is enforced so that the oil and gas companies can start reducing their pollution. And as political parties now prepare for an upcoming election, they're all very interested in knowing what their constituents care about. And the best way to have all of our voices heard is by engaging with our local elected MPs, whether it's through meetings face to face, phone calls, emails, or signing petitions. But the key element is to mobilize within our community, building a strong core of individuals, local businesses who can have a unified voice when you engage with your MPs, which will make that ask of having stronger climate action go a lot further. And to help with engaging elected officials, we do at Environmental Defense have developed a vast amount of resources. We have scripts for calling, best practices for face-to-face meetings, as well as petitions that you can sign. And we would be happy to share that after this webinar to ensure that people can use those resources to engage with their elected officials. But I'll wrap up on this. The oil and gas emissions cap, without a doubt, is a crucial policy to address Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. Without finalizing these rules, though, the federal government risks worsening the climate crisis and increasing the cost of living for all Canadians across the board. It is time for us to take a stand and demand strong action around climate. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali, for that presentation, for your perspective, for all your work. I mean, this has been, it's one of these files, these tricky regulations that every time you think you're making progress on it, the bureaucrats and the politicians punt the ball down the road a little bit, and then all of a sudden there's an extra 6 months tacked on, and then we're all scrambling. So it's been a long journey, and I know many of the folks who are on this call have been along for that journey through it as well. And so we hope that we can bring this to a successful close this spring. So I hope folks, I see the chat is active. Really appreciate that, folks. And then also Q&A. Please put your questions in. I see a few questions coming in as well. Really appreciate it, and we'll try to get to as many as we can throughout. Up next is Dr. Millie Roy, who's going to offer another perspective as one of CAPE's physician leaders, as a practicing physician and surgeon, assistant professor at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Medicine. A huge list of accomplishments in terms of efforts in ophthalmology as well as in advocacy, a climate leader through and through. So it's a real honor to have Dr. Millie Roy on this call. And without any further ado, Millie, over to you.
Thanks so much, Rob. I will just attempt to share my presentation. Great. Is everybody able to see that okay? Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here to speak to you, and to every single person who has showed up tonight to be with us. And I'm just going to dig right in. Ali is a difficult act to follow. He's already told us that fossil fuels such as oil and gas are the greatest driver of the climate crisis, and that the oil and gas sector is Canada's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, 31% of our national emissions. This year alone, Canada is expected to lose $25 billion to climate change. Yet, unbelievably, the oil and gas sector's profits have escalated 10 times between 2019 and 2022, in a few short years, from $6.6 billion to nearly $67 billion. So the emissions cap seeks to limit oil and gas sector emissions to about 35% below 2019 levels. And this is, of course, a path that we must take. So let's look at the perspective of human health. The health impacts of oil and gas are massive, especially when we consider the life cycle analysis from production to consumption. For example, the human health harms and deaths worldwide in 2020 attributed to gas alone were comparable to coal, which until recently was considered the dirtiest source of fuel on the planet. So let's look at human health harms that are associated with burning oil and gas and also with producing oil and gas. So if we look at the burning of oil and gas, health harms occur by two interconnected environmental pathways. We have the carbon pollution pathway, which produces global warming and climate change. And then we have the air pollution pathway, which produces particulate matter and toxic gases, such as nitrogen oxides, and all of these harm human health. If we look at that carbon pathway first, we know now that hands down, climate change is the single greatest risk we face to human health in our time through multiple different pathways. And this poster from the Canadian Medical Association tries to lay out the impacts of climate change right across our country. So let's take a look at some of these. First off is simple extreme heat. The 2021 BC heat dome was the single greatest weather event single deadliest weather event in Canadian history, with over 600 deaths. We know that global warming is, of course, also fueling increasingly severe wildfires. We had the heartbreak of losing Jasper right here in our country last year, and of course, the unprecedented LA wildfires ongoing. These create multiple health risks of their own. It is now estimated in Canada that somewhere between hundreds to a few thousand Canadian deaths occur due to wildfire smoke every year. And of course, this further escalates spiraling carbon emissions. The climate crisis is also damaging housing and food security, and both of these in turn are social determinants of health. We cannot be healthy unless we are well housed and well fed. And the medical community is deeply concerned that climate change may be set to aggravate nearly 60% of all human infectious diseases, while simultaneously increasing antibiotic resistance, so compounding the risks. Right here in my home province of Ontario, we may be anticipating the onset of Zika, malaria, dengue fever, things we've never seen originating in this region before. And there are devastating mental health impacts, which unfortunately land disproportionately on our youth. Depression, addiction, suicide. A recent study of 10,000 youth around the world showed that the majority, or nearly half, experience anxiety, which affects their daily functioning. Many are hesitant to have children, and the majority feel that governments are betraying them and future generations. And that's food for thought when we lobby government. Let's move now from the carbon pathway of health harms to the air pollution pathway. And how big is this problem? It is currently estimated that over 8 million people are dying prematurely around the world every year simply by breathing polluted air. And this translates to over 15,000 Canadians every year. How does this happen? Let's look at the impacts system by system when we breathe polluted air. Now, of course, the portal of entry is the lung, and the particulate matter and those toxic gases we talked about pass right across our lungs and into our bloodstreams and gain entry to the rest of our body, where it can cause multi-system disease. So in the lungs, we encounter asthma, chronic obstructive lung disease, emphysema, and more. But there are also serious heart diseases such as heart attacks, irregular heartbeats, high blood pressure, and more. There are risks to the brain, such as stroke, dementia, Parkinson's, ADHD. There are strong links to multiple cancers, especially lung, leukemia, and breast. And there are serious risks to pregnant women and infants, the most vulnerable amongst us, low birth weight, premature birth, stillbirths, and birth defects. And independent of climate change, air pollution is also an independent risk factor, both for antibiotic resistance and for serious mental health disorders ranging from anxiety to depression and suicide, with the very highest levels of scientific evidence, meta-analysis level of evidence. There are also equity issues here. In Canada, it's understood that lower socioeconomic status is linked to higher air pollution exposure and higher health risks. In America, we know that there are similar trends in racialized communities as well. Now let's move from looking at the effects of burning oil and gas to the impacts of producing it. And here's a picture of Canada's oldest oil well back in 1886, which in fact was in Ontario. But today we know the industry is centered in Alberta, and 13% of Albertans live within 1,500 meters of an oil well. Persons of Indigenous identity and lower educational backgrounds are more likely to be exposed. Methane is emitted or leaks during gas flaring, venting, combustion, and storage at these oil well sites. And health risks also arise from other pollutants that are being co-emitted alongside methane. And you can see that the list in the little diagram in the corner there. And these include respiratory and serious heart diseases and more. So let's look at the health impacts of the practice of gas flaring in particular. The impacts may occur within 3 to 10 kilometers of flaring. And again, we understand that in Alberta, 3% of Albertans live in a much smaller radius, just 1,500 meters of a gas flare. We know that particulate matter, those toxic nitrous oxides and carbon monoxide levels can be higher than recommended WHO recommended levels in sites close to these flaring areas. And in fact, the more we understand, the more we realize that really there are no safe exposure limits to many of these toxic pollutants, such as nitrogen dioxide. We are more vulnerable than we thought. But some of the health impacts that are documented with gas flaring include eye and skin irritations, asthma and other lung diseases, nervous system and mental health disorders, and premature deaths, as well as premature births. So right from birth to death, there are impacts. And the health impacts of gas production are also well understood. We now understand undoubtedly that there are health harms related to fracking gas. Nosebleeds, nausea, headaches, but also endocrine system disruptions, weight gain, and certain cancers, especially childhood leukemia risks, are 2 to 3 times higher in children who have grown up close to fracking sites. And likewise, premature death in the elderly for those who live close to and especially downwind from these sites. So to conclude, a better future is in reach. Everything that we need to achieve a healthy, thriving, sustainable future already exists. And we need to push our elected officials, our candidates, to keep this an active election issue. And health is a strong argument. So I hope all of you will take away some of what you learn here and use that to convince our elected officials. So let's demand a vote on a strong oil and gas emissions cap. Let's press for accountability with the next government, whoever that may be, and together we can make this happen. So thank you for being here, and thank you for helping make it happen.
Thank you so much, Millie. That's such a wonderful presentation. And folks are asking in the chat about whether we will be recording this session, and the answer is absolutely. We'll be sending that recording as soon as we can after the session ends. And then also, I know we haven't talked about this yet, but I'm hoping that if panelists are able to, we can also send the slide presentations to folks if there's interest there from the panelists, because there's so much valuable information there, and people would like to go over it. They'd like to use it in their advocacy. So hopefully we can send you some additional information after the call. We are really fortunate to have Jeffrey R. Brook with us tonight. Jeff is an associate professor at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto, with deep expertise in air quality and environmental health, and has been doing a ton of work on oil sands research and with Fort McKay in particular, Fort McKay First Nation and Métis Nation. So really fortunate to have you here tonight with us, Jeff, and really looking forward to hearing your vantage point on the emissions cap and oil and gas writ large. So please take it away.
Hey, thanks very much, Rob, and thanks very much for everybody for joining tonight and the opportunity to share some thoughts with you. I'm going to jump right into some slides here as well. So I'm certainly going to cover things a little bit differently from my perspectives working with the Fort McKay First Nation and previously with Environmental Climate Change Canada and the Athabasca oil sands area specifically, much more around the air quality issue. And certainly air quality and oil and greenhouse gas emissions are well linked, as Dr. Roy just said, and also Ali brought up. So I don't need to go into those details very much. But here's a little reminder of what is going on in the region around Fort McKay, Alberta. Fort McKay, there is the star in the middle of the large region of the Athabasca oil sands, part of the deposits in Alberta. And this is certainly a very large resource, on the order of 163 billion barrels of extractable oil seen there, which places it as a very large reserve globally. That area has seen incredible growth over the years with respect to the amount of emissions that have been happening and how the air quality is expanded, with examples here of what we can see from space. So you can see, air pollution from that region from satellites in space, in this case, nitrogen dioxide, and how it has spread with the growth in greenhouse gas emissions and production and air pollution from the mid 2000s up to the later parts of the 2010. And that growth is in some ways still continuing. And around Fort McKay itself, I circle two areas that are parts of open pit or surface mining. And that's where much of the activity happens in that region and has the greatest potential to create air quality problems. Some of the ones that Fort McKay regularly experiences that are attributable to the oil and gas industry there are odors, recurring odors related to sulfurous compounds and also hydrocarbons. But dust is an increasing issue there. And we're now seeing that dust deposition is exceeding guidelines. And at the same time, as we look more closely at the suspended particulate matter related to dust, we see that while PM 2.5, the pollutant we think about a lot, is elevated at times, what's being sometimes overlooked is the larger particles that are produced in that area, the PM10 or coarse particles, and even the total suspended particulates, which are quite unique in that area compared to typical levels in other parts of the country. There is a lot of activity that's involved in mining in these open pit mines, a lot of combustion related pollution from the heavy hauler trucks, also from the upgrading activities in the region that produce nitrogen oxides and also ultrafine particulate matter, which is something that we're learning more and more about as we study aspects of air pollution in more detail. But one of the things that makes this area unique is that the mixtures there are incredibly complex. They're not really things you can think about in a single pollutant way of thinking, because they are all coming together and occurring together. And some of our research has shown that quite clearly. let's just dive in a bit more at what Fort McKay experiences. And this is a plot here that shows the daily maximum nitrogen dioxide levels, the 98th percentile annual, that's averaged over 3 years. And this is a metric that's used as part of the Canadian ambient air quality standards, the CAKES as they're known. And the brown line there is the current 2025 CAKES limit for nitrogen dioxide. And what we can see is that the levels in Fort McKay over a number of years now have been very close to the CAKES, but not quite exceeding it. However, the CAKES are only part of how in Canada we manage air quality. They're part of what's known as the air quality management system, which also aims to try to prevent activities occurring that are going to lead to us polluting up to the standards. And so that system has different levels that you consider and what actions you should take as you get closer and closer to the CAKES. And the one that's closest to the CAKES is called sort of the orange management level, which if you're in that range, which you can see Fort McKay clearly is between the orange and the brown, that means you should be involved in very active air quality management policies. And in this case, it's nitrogen dioxide. Now, we also know that, as you can see, in 2020, the CAKES was 60. And now in 2025, it's 42. And that should tell you something about how these are targets. They're not absolute health safety thresholds. They're targets that try to direct us towards continuous improvement. And if we want to think about what might be something closer to what could be a sort of an ultimate health limit based on current knowledge, we can look to the World Health Organization. And looking at their standards, we can see that there's an average of 52 days per year where the NO2 in Fort McKay is exceeding the WHO 24-hour standard. If we look at the annual standard and other ones, we see that 20 out of the 22 years, the NO2 level has exceeded the WHO guideline in that area. Now, other pollutants are definitely of concern. I mentioned particulate matter, and just for reference, in considering again the WHO guidelines, we see that PM 2.5 levels there are very often above the WHO guidelines, 4 to 5 years exceeding their 24-hour criteria, and all 8 of the recent years exceeding their long-term standard of 5 micrograms per cubic meter. And PM10, which I raised as a real critical issue in that region, given the nature of the activity, is also something where they're regularly above what WHO would say are the safe levels and that we should all be trying to attain. Here, where there is something that we need to really be thinking about in terms of also air quality policy in this country, which is that right now there continues to be no national standard for PM10 or coarse particles. The Canadian Council for Ministry of the Environment set the 2.5, put the PM10 aside, and has yet to come back and revisit it and establish something. And that is really doing a disservice to communities where PM10 is a greater issue than PM 2.5. I've mentioned mixtures and the unique nature of the oil and gas industry and what it's doing to this community of Fort McKay. And clearly, with where they're located, they can't avoid what's being emitted there. And this really is a considerable environmental justice or environmental racism issue in terms of the impacts and what they're expected to tolerate. And in some of the analysis we've done, we've looked at these mixtures in a little more detail and found that depending on where the wind blows from and other weather conditions and what's happening in the emissions, there are really about 8 different types of air pollution mixtures that are in themselves complex that impact the Fort McKay and area region. Those related to combustion, the nitrogen oxides, those related to sulfur being released from fuels, those related to tailings pond and upgrading and other activities like hydrogen sulfide. Open pit mining releases hydrogen sulfide. And then some of the mixtures of the diluents that are used as part of the processing. There's different processes that will lead to that. There's also a unique type of PM 2.5 or even smaller PM1 that's comprised of organic molecules that Environment Canada researchers have been finding are something that's of high level and high concern in the oil sands region, even with papers coming out just this past week in Science on what they're seeing for what's depositing in the region in the ecosystems in terms of unique organic molecules. Also, as I mentioned, PM2.5 and the larger particles, the bigger, coarser dust particles. And individually, these are really in what I would call the poor range for air pollution, about 10 to 13% of the time. And okay, that's fine. That means 90% of the time the air is clean for those. But the problem is they don't all occur together. They occur at different times. And if you look across time, like this graph shows, and say like how many of them are occurring, we can find that if you set the criteria at least one occurring and sometimes more, find that half the time Fort McKay is experiencing some type of an air pollution mixture that's of concern to the community and certainly impacting their way of life. Now, the big question is, what are the health implications? It's pretty clear from Dr. Roy that there is a lot of evidence that air pollution has implications for health at all ages, and whether they're short-term or long-term effects, they're quite serious, adding up to large numbers. But in a community the size of Fort McKay, it's very difficult to demonstrate. The numbers of people living in the community are small, and the statistical power that you need to find something makes it difficult to say they are directly impacted, even though if you talk to anyone in the community, they would certainly be indicating there's concern. So, how do we get at those health implications, which is an important question that they ask me and they ask other researchers there. And that's something where we are trying to work towards answers to that solution now. So I draw your attention to a study that's known as the Canadian Alliance for Healthy Hearts and Healthy Minds, which is led by Dr. Sonia Anand out of McMaster University. And that study is one that's part of people that are all across the country in terms of the general population, pulling people from the various long-term cohorts like the Ontario Health Study or Alberta's Tomorrow Project. But that also started a smaller sub-study that was amongst Indigenous communities. And over the last 10 years, I've managed to get Fort McKay to join the study because it now provides a larger population of Indigenous people in different locations across the country for better look at the broader range of determinants of health that affect all of the people that are part of the study, but also control groups for Fort McKay to be doing their comparisons with. And we're really in the midst of our final analysis on this, comparing how Fort McKay's health outcome prevalence looks compared to others that don't experience life in the oil sands. So this is something that we're quite excited to see where the chips will fall on this analysis. And either way, it doesn't speak to the fact that day in, day out, they're breathing what we know are above safe levels according to the World Health Organization. But now back to the topic of this meeting today, which is around emissions caps. And really the question here would be, how do we really link something that might happen in terms of setting a cap and meeting a cap and air quality benefits? And we often think about that in the climate area as the co-benefits of mitigating greenhouse gases. But in terms of the oil and gas sector, it really depends upon how that might be implemented as to whether or not we're going to realize air pollution co-benefits from something that they might be doing. Thinking about what you hear being talked about a lot, carbon capture and storage, there's not a lot of ways you could see that would bring air pollution co-benefits, given its target at pulling out carbon dioxide, but not other air pollutants at the same time. So we really need to think about other ways that could be achieved, and that's through energy efficiency and some of the aspects of the operations, such as the heavy hauler fleets or other aspects of production in the region, as ways that you can realize stronger co-benefits towards the air pollution health linkages that Dr. Roy mentioned. Now, there is also a large proportion of the Fort McKay air quality impacts that is attributable to the surface mining. And here's where I get into a little more of my editorial here, and that is just to thinking about, well, how do we begin to address emissions and have a real meaningful improvement on the environmental impacts and air quality. And one way would be to be looking back at that map I showed at the beginning, which showed the large deposits in the area around Fort McKay, and particularly a lot of the surface mining happening there. Well, that is some of the more dirtiest, highest impact in terms of air pollution and environmental impacts aspects of getting energy from bitumen and the oil sands. There are other ways that could be done where you could still sustain the production and growth, but shifting emphasis towards in situ, where you can be more aggressive in carbon capture and storage and begin to clean up the very dirty aspects of the industry. Of course, we don't understand how that will be paid for, how carbon capture and storage will be brought to fruition, if that's really a direction we should go. And I'm not advocating for that, but it is something that gets put on the table. Are there other ways we might get energy from this valuable resource? I believe there are that don't require turning it into oil for us to burn in our cars. And as I saw in one of the Q&As down there, Stan Houston reminded us very clearly that we can't forget that the largest climate impact from what's happening there is the downstream use of the product. And that is really pointing us towards reduced production, reduced consumption over time as something that we can all be part of. We all have to really be changing our consumption behaviors, our use of fuel, and encouraging that far and wide. Now, I noted a number of the panelists talking about the keeping the heat on, how this is an important election issue, how there is ways that we can be making sure that this is not something that gets dropped from the Canadian discussion. And I certainly wholeheartedly agree with that. I wholeheartedly agree with the inequities that this brings to future generations or those who are directly impacted, like the people in Fort McKay. But I also, in my own lobbying to my own local MP, who's conservative, I try to, in some ways, aim low and just ask him to please take environmental issues and particularly climate change out of political debate. This should be an issue that all parties get behind and work for the benefit of Canadians now and in the future. And so I even just that little step forward is saying this should not be a greenwashing issue that we debate in politics. We should be putting all hands on deck to deal with this is the way we should be approaching this. So thanks for your attention. I look forward to the discussions.
Thank you so much, Jeff. A real pleasure to have you here with us tonight. And thanks to all of you again. The chat continues and questions are flowing in. So just a quick time check. We're at 7:44 Eastern and various other times across this great land. I know it looks like we're still well on track, and I think given the amazing quality of questions that are coming in, I think what we'll do is we'll kind of squeeze out the moderator questions and then turn the floor to a lot of the questions coming from the audience. So please keep them coming. We're going to go through them for the last portion of the call, which is still on track to end at 8:20 Eastern today. But before we get to that, our next speaker, Sunshine Dunstan Moore, is joining us. And Sunshine, for some reason, has decided this is going to be the second event that she's doing with Environmental Defense and with Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. So clearly, a big appetite for talking about emissions cap. It's a real pleasure to have you here, Sunshine. Sunshine's got an amazing list of accomplishments for such a young age. Junior policy analyst with Assembly of First Nations, former chair of ECCC's Ministerial Youth Council, member of the Youth Advisory Group at the Canadian Commission of UNESCO. So many accomplishments already and such interesting perspectives. So without any further ado, Sunshine, I'd like to hand the mic over to you.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen here. Hopefully it works. Okay, awesome. Just going to move my notes because now my notes are in the way. Kukshem, thank you. Yadik Shishk, everyone, good evening. As you can tell, I'm in a car. Apologies for this. So just a quick disclaimer, these annual stickers have no factual significance for my presentation. We're living in a very scary time, and just gotta have some fun. We just have to have some fun, and fun and joy is an act of resistance.
Sunshine, can I just jump in for a second? We can't see your slides if you're showing any right now.
No. Okay, I am. It says it's sharing. Should I stop it and try again?
Yeah, let's give that a shot.
Okay, let's try this.
And if not, the last time that you were at an emissions cap event with us, I don't think you had any slides, so it was amazing anyway. So I'm sure we could do it. There we go. We can see them. Great.
Awesome. Amazing. So I'm going to be talking about policy advocacy and the environment. So the disclaimer was the animal stickers, as you can see, have no factual significance. It's just to bring some joy and fun into the conversation. We're living in a very scary time, and as a young person, it's really hard to find those small moments. And so when I like to make slide decks and presentations, I'm like, you know what? Let's have some fun with it. Let's make it a little unconventional. And it's even more fun when you have access to a Canva Pro account that you forget to cancel. So a little bit about myself. Rob was kind enough to talk about a bit of my professional experience. Yadikshish Squaquash more. My name is Squaquash, which translates to sunshine. I am of Nicolaam, Stratliam, and Yakima descent from Comsheen, also known as Lytton, British Columbia. I'm calling in from the Kamloops, BC, though. If you see me tearing up, it's because I just had an eye appointment, so I might be wiping my eyes. And I currently live on Anishinaabe Algonquin territory, also known as Ottawa. You heard a bit about my professional experience, but why I'm here, why I'm in this fight, is I'm from Lytton, British Columbia, and 3 years ago we experienced, I'm not crying because of this, I don't cry because of this anymore. We experienced the Lytton Creek fire, which burnt down 90% of my community, and I, very unlucky, got to watch it from across the Fraser River. I like to say that it's my villain origin story, that it ignited my fire to fight the climate crisis at a systemic and policy level. So my background, these are photos from COP28 and COP29. I've been fortunate enough to be in the international space now for about 3 years. Working with the local communities and Indigenous peoples platform within UNFCCC and the children and youth major groups as well. So a little bit of what I want to talk about today is taking an anti-colonial and intersectional approach to policy, indigenizing policy, and how joy is an act of resistance. And this is the anti-colonial intersectional approach is really what I align myself in the work that I do. It's what drives and what I advocate highly for in all the spaces that I'm in. So I have this fun little graph here that I made because I know a lot of folks are kind of visual learners and I would not be able to explain this. So intersectionality is when a lot of folks talk about intersectionality, there's a bunch of different kind of Venn diagrams that you can find online, and they are made very pretty. I come from a communications background, so I understand creating things with an aesthetic to catch people's eye, to make it seem easy reading, to have it be perceived in a way that hits a large audience. Intersectionality, unfortunately, is not that. Intersectionality is looking into the nitty-gritty of what is missing, what is the in-betweens, and that is chaotic and that is complex. So I made this a little while ago because I enjoyed how crazy it looked. Because that's what it is. We're talking about human nature and human personalities and emotions, and humans in themselves are complex and chaotic. And that is the beautiful part of being human. To quote Shrek, onions have layers, and we both have layers. I didn't want to say ogres because we are not ogres, we're humans, but it's that concept of all these layers that we have as a being, and understanding that we fit in some places more than we fit in other places. So if we were to take this into a climate policy or any kind of policy structure or a system, we have like the main big parts, of course, like human rights, disability, housing, health. I really hope you can see my cursor. And then sometimes that's where we just stop. We look at the bigger themes and then the checklist goes just to that. But we need to start looking deeper. So when we look into ethnicity, we need to look into race because they are two different things that often people use interchangeably. And how does race affect health? How does health affect food sovereignty? When we consider rural, remote, and northern barriers, how is their health being impacted by food sovereignty? It's looking at these little questions that are often forgotten, missed, or just plain out ignored, especially if you're coming from Black, Indigenous, and marginalized communities. So I've been advocating for an intersectional approach because I found myself fitting in a lot of these different boxes that governments, organizations, projects like to put you in. And that's because they need to, I always get these two mixed up. It's quantify, I believe that's the numbers one. I believe it's quantify. They need to quantify things. To a degree, I understand because that's how you get the funding, that's how you get the grants. But a lot of the times when it comes with projects and studies, that's where it kind of just stops. It's the check boxes and that's it. But when we take it one step further and get the qualitative, that's right, the qualitative data, and start bringing in and asking those questions, I really hope I didn't get those backwards because I see the chat going off a bit. But we start asking those deeper questions and getting those answers, we start to actually learn how the root cause of things have happened. I have the anti-colonial kind of surrounding this little diagram because unless we take an anti-colonial approach to the work that we're doing within intersectionality, we'll just continue to perpetuate the same colonial harm. And this can be detrimental to rural communities, northern communities who have had long-standing structures in place to keep them going, especially during the winter months with food sovereignty and water. A lot of the times, big companies, organizations, and the government like to come in and not do the qualitative stuff and just be like, here's the new water plant for you. But it's not taking into account, it's a small rural community. They don't have the resources, funding, sometimes even personnel to come in and keep this water plant going up. Whereas probably they had a system already in place. It just does not look your Western science way. It probably looks like, I've been told some of my projects have looked like garbage. And it's because we reuse. We have a circular economy that many communities, Indigenous, have kind of just found ways to keep reusing their things, keep reusing their resources, what they have, because that's what we've depended on for since colonization. To talk a bit more about indigenizing climate policy. Indigenizing, being anti-colonial are two different concepts. It's important to recognize and address these differences because I know I've seen a lot of folks using indigenizing, decolonizing, and anti-colonial interchangeably. They're all different. And it's important to address those because how you approach those can, again, have huge impacts on communities, and not just for Indigenous communities, any marginalized community. So indigenizing spaces, which a lot of people think it's being decolonial, you're really indigenizing spaces. Having I believe I missed this part, but I believe there was an Indigenous speaker who opened up the space. That's indigenizing the space. Land acknowledgements, that is indigenizing. That's not decolonizing, that's indigenizing. My home community of Layton, we had our road signs posted in our language. That is indigenizing. It's I like to look at it as an ecosystem, taking it from indigenizing to decolonizing, because you can get there. To decolonize is to be like, hey, we need to take this to a systemic level, not just the surface level. So, bringing in Indigenous policies into the colonial structure, very complex. There is a lot of back and forth and discourse on this, but it's sitting down and having those kind of conversations. Yeah, so integrating Indigenous sciences and ways of knowing and knowledge into policies. And sometimes it's just accepting from the colonial side, it's accepting that, you know what, we won't have Western science back up Indigenous ways of knowing. We are starting to get there. We are seeing it in some places, but we need to start seeing it be mass produced around the country. And it's not in pan-indigenizing either. It's where you're working, work with those local Indigenous places. And again, it's being actively anti-colonial. Decolonizing and being anti-colonial is a lifelong journey. I myself, you're never going to be perfect at it. It's going to be uncomfortable, and it's getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. It's being okay with sometimes saying the wrong thing. It's not like, oh, I'm not Indigenous, so I'm not going to speak on that. I think that's done to a lot of places. And then so the burden is put on the Indigenous person, but it's done in a way that it can be very harmful, because if you're being anti-colonial, it's acknowledging that you're uncomfortable and do it anyway. If you're scared, trust me, we're scared too. We're scared to be in these spaces, but we show up and we come as we are, and we hope to have that kind of reciprocal relationship. And joy is an act of resistance. I think this is super important as a young person. I heard a bit about climate anxiety. Everyone, not just young people, but everyone, we are experiencing this collective trauma that no one has really done throughout our history, because of the access we have to social media, the access we have to the news, and the access to information we have nowadays. And the anxiety that comes from it is, and then guilt, the survivor's guilt that we feel, that we're not experiencing the same level of climate trauma as another person, that we're okay. It tends to lead a lot of people to not to look into fulfilling their life, to be okay with just being content, to burn out from constantly fighting the climate crisis and the planetary crises that we're in, because we're not just in one crisis here. And if you want to go even a step further, because I was talking about intersectionality, talking about the political crises we're in, not just within Canada, but nationally or internationally. There are so many levels to why the mental health crisis we're in nowadays. So I like to say that joy is an act of resistance. I like to try and make things fun. As uncomfortable as it may be, sometimes you do just need to see a silly animal on the screen. Sometimes you need to have a young person who is very clearly a little sick right now. But as a young person, this is our life. We have to constantly just go through the thick of it and keep going and keep fighting, because this is our future. This has been my life for the past 15 years. And we just, with the older generation, we want to leave something better for the next generation after us. And I think that we hoped we got a little bit more of that normalness, whatever that may be. but we've been given a hand and we're doing what we can with it. And I think that having a bit of sympathy for the generation is something that we need. Because I can tell you, I did not want to be a policy analyst. I did not want to be working with the government. I wanted to be an actor, but I saw a sense of responsibility in ensuring having a planet for my family, having something for the next generation. So this is kind of where my path has led me. But that's just because of what I see the current, what we've grown up in. And I can bet you any much you can ask so many people that what was their dream when they were a kid and what they would have done. But what did their responsibility tell them to go do? So I just want to say Cook's Gem, thank you. Looking forward to the conversation we're going to have.
Thank you so much, Sunshine. Really powerful and really wonderful that you could join us, despite despite the eye appointment and everything else. It's a lot to make the time, and really appreciate it. So we've got time is ticking, right? We want to wrap this call up by 8:20. And so what I've tried to do is I've gone through questions that you've been asking in the Q&A box, and I've been trying to kind of squish them and mold them a little bit so that we can get some questions get kind of compressed and rolled into a handful. And hopefully we'll be able to tackle a few issues at once this way. So why don't we kick things off for our esteemed panel and just talk at a really high level. There are a bunch of questions about carbon capture and storage as a technological solution. What are its upsides? What are its downsides? And what's its role in an effective emissions cap? Would anyone like to tackle the CCS or CCUS question? Ali, over to you.
Yeah. I'm not sure how to, there we go. Yeah, okay. Carbon capture, wow. Well, I gotta share something about this technology. So this is a technology that has been in play for about 50 years now. And despite billions and billions, and I'm talking like 60 billion plus, like major amount of subsidies from the federal government, it has failed to achieve any meaningful reductions. And it still continues to be that red herring of sorts for the industry as a way to delay actual emissions reductions. It is not an actual climate solution that the industry has, but unfortunately, because of their lobby powers, they have somehow convinced elected leaders in this country and many other countries as well as a way that it could potentially somehow, some way be able to reduce emissions. And like Jeffrey said earlier, it says in the name, carbon capture. It aims to capture carbon only, not the other greenhouse gases that are associated with the production of oil and gas. And still, the small amount that it is able to capture ultimately is used to continue producing even more oil and gas with the enhanced oil recovery. So flat out, not a climate solution. It is another one of those greenwashing misinformation tactics that the industry has to somehow try to dupe us into thinking that this mythical, magical technology is going to solve all the problems and they get to continue producing oil and gas and rake in billions of dollars. But does not work. Science, data, history shows us that.
Thanks, Ali. Okay, the next question is impossible, but I'll ask all the panelists to see if anyone wants to take a crack at it. So it's a combination of questions again. So there are a bunch of questions on political strategy, right? Is what we're doing working? Can it be done better? What's the best way to proceed, especially in light of the fact that we're seeing climate change kind of drift from the priorities, it seems, of policymakers, and especially because we've got a wild card now in the United States, and Trump seems to be turning over a lot of norms once again. So the question is, as a movement, as people who care about climate change, as people who care about the emissions cap in particular, what should be done in light of this evolving context? Who wants to take a crack at that? There's no shame.
I,
No
sure.
one wants to.
Oh.
Millie, please go ahead.
Someone's got to go first. I'll maybe just say, well, as Rob first said, it's an impossible question. But I think, one of the things that we aim to do through CAPE is to try to use the health argument, especially in a context where climate itself is now sort of a lower priority, especially if we're talking, sort of election time. It's sadly no longer in sort of the top few voter concerns, but health is. The health argument can also help to depoliticize the issue, and if we can, and that's already been mentioned during the evening today, that if we can basically get this out of the realm of sort of a political, is it a blue issue, is it a red issue, and make it a public health issue, that's a sort of a tactic or an approach that we can take. And I guess one of the other things that I myself have been wondering about, where Rob, asked about the complicated issue of what's going on south of the border and, what will that do, is the fact, for instance, let's say with energy in Ontario, we have policies that are really making us continue on gas, and the majority of our gas is coming from the United States. If there are retaliatory tariffs, what will that do to the price of energy? And what about a conversation of energy independence, which again, points towards conservation, renewable energy, and so on, where we can provide our own and be independent. So a number of different points there for a very, very difficult question.
Thanks, Millie. And of course, we could all go into much greater detail on strategic ideas. Hopefully you're getting some from the various panel discussions. I've got two technical questions back to back for Jeff, but before that, I see Ali has his hand up.
Really quickly, about the last question. Definitely, it is a challenging time. We are up against an industry, and not just the oil and gas industry, basically all polluters that are, have a lot of resources, can lobby way more, can spend a lot more money than we can. But we also have to recognize that there have been wins. The fact that we're even talking about an oil and gas emissions cap, being a possible regulation that can be implemented, is based on collective advocacy from communities across this country. And I think sometimes it's hard to recognize that, our mobilization, our advocacy can work. But in these times, especially, I think it's really important that we recognize the wins as well, no matter how small they are. So just want to make sure that people understand the power that we have. It's super important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so these are two questions.
Can I actually quickly touch on that as well? I just don't know how to raise my hand. I don't have a raise hand button. But I just want to remind people that there is a lot of work being done. It may not be done politically, but grassroots level, youth, young people, even like seniors, there is so much work being done that it's primarily unseen. The reason why, like on the politics side, it's so big is because you have very kindly loudmouths who do just put out slogans and sayings to kind of divert your attention away to the work that is being done and to cause that anxiety. And it's also bringing, like, just to acknowledge that there are a lot of folks who can't vote, who have their reasons why they don't vote. I know Indigenous voting is down, and that's from a long stem of colonization. Unjust immigration policies have left a lot of people unable to vote in this country, and I think it's also important to acknowledge that part. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Sunshine. Okay, so Jeff, there's some questions coming in around pollutants. One is from Carolyn about the jet stream moving from west to east. So the question is, with the jet stream moving from west to east, how far do these pollutants move to affect larger populations? I guess this is pollutants from oil and gas development in Alberta, and I'll just pair it with, and in other provinces too, I presume. I'll pair it with another question from Anne. What health problems does PM10 cause?
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Well, pollutants like the particles do move large distances, but they become much more dilute and So, and of course, for the areas I research in the oil sands and parts of Alberta, they're blowing into less populated regions where they're having less direct health effect. The environmental impacts, though, do occur larger field. The direct emissions from the oil sands area are seen into mid Saskatchewan quite easily and farther. Of course, those are remote areas. The overall population and oil and gas industry in Alberta itself is something that we've detected and seen flowing south of the border. So it's actually a transboundary issue with Canada sending pollution into United States. And it all adds up to, what else is there in terms of the potential health implications. PM10, as I point out, is really missing in the Canadian air pollution policy war chest right now, is by itself what had been studied a lot before PM2.5 was studied, also related to mortality and other acute effects like PM2.5. But we know that PM10 has PM2.5 in it. So the sense has been that it's really been those tinier fractions of particles that have been doing the effect. However, myself and colleagues have had research that we've done in Toronto where we're able to expose people to just the coarse particles. And with just that, we're able to see much of the same things we saw with PM2.5 around increases in blood pressure, impacts in the vasculature. And so they're not inert particles. They do have a harm as well. And I do, see that it's, the previous question is a very difficult one. And it's, again, something where we need to think about trying to separate what we need to do around greenhouse gas emissions from politics domestically, but also internationally. And those are some, areas where we know there's so much technology that could be brought to bear that would help reduce emissions and bring health co-benefits in the transportation sector. But, we're playing even big politics internationally in terms of picking, who we would buy our solar panels from or won't buy them from, or, trying to keep less expensive electric vehicles out of our country, to not want to make the U.S. angry with us when we know that China has produced many and can really deliver quite a few. So there are, I think there's a broader international way we could exercise Canadian will and maybe leadership.
Thanks so much, Jeff. And I know we're coming close to the 8:15 mark Eastern. I thought maybe I'd keep another extremely difficult question for the panelists. Maybe this might go to Ali or maybe Millie, folks who've been working on the kind of policy side of the emissions cap for a little while. And it's just about, is this enough, right? We've spent all this time. There's a question from Michelle, and she goes over, some of the key pieces. I know, Ali, that you and I've discussed on a regular basis, right? The implementation dates are slipping. How do you monitor compliance and verify reporting? There's an emissions trading element to this. How can we make sure that that works? So bottom line, even if this becomes law, do we get enough bang for the buck? Is this a lot of advocacy for something that isn't good enough? And I'll also add Roger's question, which is questioning one of the mechanisms by which it does cap emissions, which is, again, the carbon capture and storage piece. How much from carbon capture and storage? So we just want to kind of float that there. We're struggling with these targets. We're struggling with these implementation dates. Is this policy enough? What should we do about what we're seeing in front of us as part of the regulatory process?
Maybe I can start us off, and then feel free to jump in, Dr. Millie. So definitely there are ways to improve this policy. It is not strong enough to get us to a future that would be climate safe. I referenced this in my presentation, but just to keep it brief, the targets have to be increased. The International Energy Agency, which is like a global expert body for energy use and supply and demand, recommends that oil and gas companies across the world reduce their pollution by 60% if we want to have a world where we are able to limit global warming to 1.5. Canada's own 2030 targets are to reduce it by 45% from 2005 levels. The current targets don't even match that. So part of the advocacy that Environmental Defense, CAPE, many others do, is to ensure that the federal government is able to strengthen these targets. Same thing with the implementation date. the way it stands right now, this oil and gas pollution cap would not help meet Canada's 2030 targets. And there are loopholes involved too, offsets, decarbonization fund. But to the point around, is this too much advocacy for something that's not perfect? And I disagree. I think it's better to have something that is not perfect right now that can be strengthened rather than to have nothing at all and then let oil and gas companies continue to pollute as they have been without any accountability. I think having a mediocre emissions cap is better starting point to strengthen it than going back to zero. And I think that would be a big missed opportunity if we do that. If Canada does that. If it was up to me, we would have it today. But
any other perspectives on what to do in this political moment? Double down, push for the perfect. Is the perfect the enemy of the good? Any perspectives here?
I'll just echo Ali to say that I think that a huge value of the advocacy, of the collective action, is not just the absolute specs that we come out with in a policy like this, but it is to remind our elected officials that this matters. It's to remind each other that it matters. And it's to try to build on the advocacy as we go along to pull more people in along the way. As the manifestations of the impacts of burning oil and gas, producing oil and gas become more and more apparent. We have a lot of disinformation to fight along the way. I think that's been a very disturbing sort of counter force that is really increasing. But we need to keep up that momentum, not only looking at, our final outcome right now, but seeing this as a journey and a process. So.
Thank you so much, Millie, and thank you to all of our panelists for the great presentations today. Thank you to the team. There's a team in behind, with their cameras off, working very hard.
Mom and doctor.
Oh, sorry. People are playing the video. So I have this. That does remind me. I put a letter to target link in the chat, as well as a video starring Dr. Millie Roy. And I hope that folks can sign and send the letter to their MPs. I hope they check out and share the video asking for a strong and fair emissions cap. Really want to thank all of you for taking the time to join us here tonight, this evening, wherever you are across this very large landmass. I really hope you stay engaged in climate action. I hope there's lots of takeaways tonight. We will be sharing the recording, and then where the panelists are able to, willing and able, we'll also share slide presentations. If there are any follow-ups, of course, I think everyone's probably received at least 5 emails from me. You know where to find me. Happy to answer any questions or put you in touch with the panelists as need be. Again, thank you for coming out. Really appreciate your time, and I hope everyone has a great night.